The first question, or it's really perhaps two questions, and it's about the relation between contemplative tradition as primary theology and about the reflection about contemplative traditions. Would it be feasible to understand contemplative traditions as primary theology, similarly as liturgical theology understands prayer as a primary theology? And so that's, in a sense, the first question, but at the same time, reflections on spiritual practices seems to have shaped spiritual practices itself. So how could we understand the relationship between spiritual practices and secondary reflection? Would you be so kind to let us open the discussion, Father Andrew?
Is that, oh, that's on this side. I thought it was on. It had light on. So as I understand the first question, it's behind that there's another issue, which is where do you start your theology from anyway? And traditionally in the West, you start your theology by consideration of being, some sort of metaphysics. And out of this you evolve the notion of God, and then you go on from there. And one thing that I've tried to do this in one of my little books recently, is to look at this rather differently. And partly I'm inspired by somebody who's already been mentioned, Jean-Luc Marion, who in, I think, his first book, L'Idole et la Distance, is talking about Dionysius the Areopagite and the way in which Dionysius talks about God as atia, which means cause or ground. But he wants to say that isn't really what it means. It comes from the word etiume, which means to beseech. And so God is le requisite, the one whom we beseech, the one whom we address in prayer, the one to, and that for him, he wants to say, this for Dionysius is where you start your theology. You start your theology not by considering God in metaphysical terms or in moral terms or whatever, but you start your theology by God being the one to whom we address our prayers. And I would have thought that one way of developing, the most obvious way of developing this, I think, would be to see contemplation as something that is the primary way in which we relate to God. And so exploring that is, as it were, the theologia prima for a theology that approaches it from the perspective of the contemplative traditions.
Thank you. Do you want to continue, Mikael?
If I can place some questions directly to you.
Yes, you may.
You had an article, Father Andrew, where you discussed Saint Maximus the Confessor and Ecclesiology. That was spread around, and you can still find it on the internet, I think. But you used the idea of recapitulation as a kind of pattern for unity and diversity. Would you say that recapitulation is a practice or a kind of theory?
Sorry, I think that is an unfairly difficult question because the whole what is meant by recapitulation and kephalaiosis is about 6 possibilities. I mean, it can be a summation, it can be it could be a summation, it actually simply can mean a list. But it usually has, I suppose, the sense of, I suppose, going through everything again in a way that enables one to appreciate the value of all the bits that one is trying to recapitulate. And part of the difficulty is I can't remember what it was that I said, and I suspect that calling it recapitulation is putting a gloss on what I said originally, but I can't remember what I said in that context in relation to Maximus. But I think Maximus's doctrine of the I can't remember, sorry.
You argue for a primary perspective in a church, that the church begins from the bottom and not from the top, by reversing the order. And that became very interesting, at least in my view. But I still haven't understood if this is a reflection on the church or if it's a practical realization of a church. If it's a practical realization of a church, it becomes very interesting, because that means that the church exists from below, so to say.
Well, I think, in fact, yes, I would want to say that trying to understand the church from, I suppose, from below, which I think one must mean in this context, not considering the notion of hierarchy in a sociological sense as the primary category for understanding the institution of the church. And I would agree with you. I would agree with what you said. I think I would want to say that hierarchy should be used in the sense in which Dionysius used it, which is the principle of unification within the church. He says it is a power and order and whatever by which ultimately the world through the church is divinized. It's a way of assimilation to God. This is what hierarchy means, and hierarchy is the way in which God reaches out from his simplicity into the multiplicity of the created order and draws the creation back to himself. And that's what hierarchy primarily means for Dionysius. The way in which it's been, first of all, used in the church in an institutional way, and now used by sociologists in an institutional way, seems to me to be a thinning down of what the word really means. It is much more a process, much less a principle of institutional hierarchy, institutional order, rank, whatever.
Thank you.
That, I think, that is starting from where we are. And I think you are right that particularly I think in Orthodoxy, Orthodoxy very quickly allowed itself to be modelled institutionally on the empire. The principle of bishops in cities, metropolitans in provinces, patriarchs. This system, which emerged pretty quickly, is simply modelled on the structure of the Roman Empire, as it was in around about the 4th century. And I think that it was perhaps justifiable at the time because, well, that's where the church was, in the Roman Empire. But I think there's a great danger of thinking that these structures are not temporary structures for the church as it was then, but permanent structures that have to be replicated in whatever society we're in. And that seems to me nonsense, basically.
Thank you very much. Origins is a very tricky question, I suppose. Also origins of panel discussions. We diverged a little bit from the original question. I will remind Ivana, if you want to hear, it's on the contemplative traditions and prayer as a primary starting point for theology and reflection and the relation between reflective and contemplative traditions. If you are very welcome to enter into this discussion as well, of course. But,
thank you very much. I think there would be 2 points which would be important for me. On one hand, I would say, sure, I think that contemplative prayer is also the primary theology, and I probably would want to go to the experience of God as the beginning of all theology, as Metropolitan Callistos was speaking about in his introductory lecture. And this is the way I try when I start the introductory course of theology. This is how I want to introduce theology to my students. The start with the experiential basis, where there would be religious experience in the narrow sense, but also in the broad sense, all human experience understood theologically, which would be, I think, important primary ground for me. But then when I speak about the primary and secondary, I think I would not definitely see them as options either or. And I would not even see them as separate. For me, this would be more like joint jars, if I were to use this example from physics. This is probably as far as my physics will go. But there is this connection that the way one is developed would influence the other. But I think also already when we speak either about liturgical prayer or about contemplative prayer, or even within ourselves when we are within the communities that share that prayer, when we try to grasp the meaning, the reflection is already there. Earlier on, I was talking with Father Andrew about George Tyrrell, and he came back to my mind, his little article which he wrote earlier on theology and devotion, where he says that if you don't have the experience of what you want to talk about, it would always remain alien to you. And that you can have a perfect scientific knowledge, but it would still be empty if there is not this experiential basis. And he comes back to it in one of his final books. I can't remember whether it's Theology or Christology as the crossroads, one or the other. What? Christianity at the crossroads, my source of wisdom. And he says there that it's like if somebody sees a city, that person is an artist, you can draw a sketch, and you can do the sketches from many different sides, but the sketches still will not be able to replace the original. But if somebody has never seen the city, would not be able to provide any meaningful sketch of that. And I think in this sense the primary theology would have a role as primary, but definitely not as isolated or as something which would be not influenced by the reflection already.
Thank you. Davor.
Can I ignore your question and go back to the discussion from a couple of minutes ago? Yeah, thank you. I'm very much interested in this question of power, and especially in the ecclesial context of ecclesiology. So I just like to offer a couple of thoughts and then ask basically Father Louth and also Michael to maybe respond to them. Because what I find very striking is that, for example, in the case of Eucharistic theology, that in one sense it can be understood as a project of arguing in favor of an ecclesiology from below. It has an emancipatory potential. But then in a certain way it ended up, at least in certain contexts, in again affirmation of certain power structures and being bishopocentric. In the case of the Roman Empire, we saw how Church quickly adopted the power structure or the framework of the empire and adopted it for its own purposes. So we have seen attempts to counterfight that by organizing the Church along the lines of more contemporary models. But again, the question of power becomes crucial. So we have, for example, cases where we have boards that resemble corporate boards in the Church, and then they very often terrorize bishops and priests in a similar way in which, in other contexts, bishops and priests terrorize the parishioners or believers. So my question there would be that, how do we use theology that very often works well in theory for organizing Church institutionally in a way which would correspond more to what we would like to see as church based on love and this Eucharistic gathering and being one and many coming together and all that. In other words, is this challenge of power always unavoidably there for the church, and is church destined in a certain sense to mirror power structures of the age in which it functions? Or can it maybe offer alternatives so that maybe even social and political institutions can learn something from a more Christian organization of the church? Sorry.
Yeah. I think there's a question of power. In normal use, it means the ability to coerce. And I think that is not where we should be starting at all. It seems to me that what the Lord says about the power that is going to be exercised by the disciples, he seems to me to exclude katekyrievin, which in that context I think does mean the power to coerce as a Lord. And in the church, we have taken over a lot of the coercive structures, and then justify them in terms of the gospel, which I find very, very difficult to justify. I don't know. I mean, the word that is used, the word that's used in the New Testament for power in the context of government is exousia. And exousia is a word that comes from a verb, exine, which I think I'm right in saying is really only used in one context. It's used, the verb exestine, which means to permit. And throughout the Gospels, there is this sense that power means you are permitted to do something, presumably ultimately by God. I think of the conversation between Pilate and Christ, where Pilate refers to his power and says you would have no power at all unless it were given you from above. Power is something that is received and carries responsibility, rather than being the right to coerce, which is the way in which it's normally taken. But these are only very preliminary. How you translate that into structures, I don't know. I'm not sure that structures are not always going to betray what it is you're trying to do.
I'm thinking a little bit about Saint Maxim the Confessor. Maybe Torsten can help me later on here. One thing that strikes me when I was studying and had Lars Thunberg as my first guide, who was one of the scholars doing the Maxim the Confessor, he introduced for me the idea that to think about Maxim not in the sense of up and down, but instead kind of circles with the center in the middle, and where the periphery constitutes the middle, and the middle constitutes the periphery. If I get this right now with Lars Thunberg. That creates a new understanding, could be, for the power relations in the church also. If there is no center, there's no periphery. And if there is no periphery, there's no center. But usually we talk about it from upside down. And that creates a kind of mental blockade, I think, in our heads. And I think also that when I read your article, you elaborated on a different way of understanding anacaphalaiosis, which opened the path towards understanding Saint Maximus in a new way, which in fact was introduced already by Lars Thunberg in one article. I don't remember the name now, but where he elaborated on this idea also. And this mental change of periphery and center could help in this regard. But if I would be critical towards Maximus, I haven't seen a practical example in his writings that would be substantiate any kind of realization of his kind of periphery and center.
I think we can open this microphone is a bit ambivalent. I don't think it's holy though, but I think we can open up for questions and comments from the floor as well.
What has emerged out of our conversations for about a day and a half for me is potentially yet another focused conference on the matter of appeals to experience in the Orthodox tradition. Because notice something interesting has happened probably with Florensky's The Ground and Pillar of Truth, where suddenly ecclesial experience has become the kind of category that it has not been before. In terms of the sources and norms of theological knowledge in the Orthodox tradition. And what I mean by that is that typically there are appeals to scripture and tradition, and then those are seen as kind of exhausting what's at stake in the kind of gamut of possibilities of what theologians need to be appealing to. And so I guess what I'm interested in primarily is casting the appeals to religious experience in the Orthodox theology of the 20th and 21st century against the background of appeals to religious experience from Schleiermacher on, or perhaps from the Pietist tradition on, and trying to understand how similar appeals in Western theology have led to certain distortions of the whole theological enterprise, and have also at the same time illuminated other aspects of theological enterprise. I mean, presently, at least in Western theology, we are now presently in a situation where appeals to not just religious experiences, but simply experiences of particular underprivileged communities norm what theology is about. And then the name of the game is precisely to figure out whose community's minority status entitles it subsequently to normative claims in theological anthropological sphere. It seems to me narrowing experience, for example, to Eucharistic experience, or let's say experience of light, and other very select, shall we say, pages of ascetical experience or liturgical experience, on the one hand, as I said already, is illuminating, and on the other hand, narrows the theological enterprise. So my concern sort of consistently throughout all of this is that I think this has an unintended implication of sidelining the centrality of the divine revelation. And so let me just single out that kind of concern. So this doesn't really come in the form of the question. This comes in the form of a potential competition in this case between these strong appeals, fairly strong appeals to religious experience on the one hand, and therefore, if nothing else is added beyond the appeals to ecclesial experience, for example, then I think something is inevitably will be missing. And I'm just, if the panel wanted also to respond to this observation, I would be very grateful too. Thank you.
Okay, maybe I will start. Thank you, Paul. I think that it depends very much what you do with religious experience or with spiritual experience. To start with, if we would see the experience as normative, I think it's an error. This is not what is the role of experience, to be a norm. and the normativity belongs to the level of reflection and of the common reflection. Another thing you mentioned, Schleiermacher. I think the revival of the experiential side of theology, which you would find with Schleiermacher, with Rudolf Otto, with William James, I think in their period of time they suffered the individualist distortion of experience. And I think this has been for a long period of time critically reflected. So it's not necessarily the error which would be done. I think earlier on when we spoke about the non-reductionist theology, which would not exclude the classical sources of dogmatic theology, but would expand them also for the ascetical theology. I think you can see it maybe on similar ways of expanding what we see as important for theology. And of course there would be various layers of experience. Another danger would be that people would be forced to some kind of experience which they do not have or cannot have. And without that they would be said that their theology would be only second class. I think this would be a danger and this would be wrong path as well. But because there are wrong paths, it doesn't mean that inclusion of the experience is not important. I think it is, but you need to include it as what it is.
This is very interesting. Contemplative traditions and practice is not normative. I was thinking about the lecture by Thomas Grauman about the ecumenical councils. That highlights a lot of this issue about normativity and practice. I just reflected on it when I heard Ivana. That's interesting, but it's a big question.
Yes, I think that the normativity comes at the reflective level, at the secondary level. But as I said, that they are not separated. It's not that any experience would be genuine experience. Experience needs the discernment. What is the source of experience? What is the content of experience? Where does it lead? Etc., etc. I still like, I have to say, the very early phenomenological insight into experience by Franz Brentano. Which is a little bit mechanistic when he speaks about 3 stages of experience. One, which would be presentation. Second, which would be judgment. And for the third one, he doesn't even have one word. He would say it's the movement of feelings and actions, the movement of will. But although this separation is artificial, I think what he wants to say is that interpretation and judgment is in a way necessary part of experience if we want to take it as experience for ourselves and if we want to communicate it. So here you have the joint together. And then also he would say that there is a presentation, something which is coming from outside before the question of truth or of value is being raised. It comes only with reflection. And probably with this very simple phenomenological background, I would say that the question of normativity doesn't come before the experience, but in reflection of the experience.
I think the notion of experience is very, very slippery. I start off with, I think, the experiences we have are already interpreted, and the interpretative frameworks we bring to them are going to determine the kind of things we recognize as being experience at all. And it just at one level, I think one wants to say something like this, that experience is important because otherwise everything will be completely abstract. And that obviously we don't want things to be completely abstract, and therefore some sense of experience is important. But in many of the contexts in which people do appeal to experience, they're appealing to experience because, well, really out of desperation, I think, in this sense, that an appeal to experience is often a way of saying, well, look, I've experienced it and therefore it must be true. and that doesn't seem to me to be a very helpful line to take in any discussion, really. And it's, Orthodox theology is in the last century has been very much open to that way of talking. I think the notion of experience is far more complicated than it's what you're doing when you're appealing to experience could be one of several things. And I think one has to be quite clear about, fairly clear about what one's up to. Basically.
I would just like to follow up on what Father Louth said. I think another complication with experience nowadays is that it tends to be very individualistic, but in this kind of postmodern sense of feel good, almost ideology, so that we like certain experiences. I should, yeah. And that is another danger. How do we cope with that? How do we cope with unpleasant experiences that can have important theological or faith-related messages? So that would be one problem. Another problem is that we cannot but experience things in order to be in touch with anything. So doing theology necessarily means grasping certain concepts and creating ideas about what theology is and how we do it based on certain experiences that we have had or that we have at the moment when we try to cope with these concepts. And I think that is also something that is very underexplored. Thinking, how much our own experiences that are culture related, family related, psychology related, and all of that impact our perception of certain concepts from the church tradition. And of course, the old question, which of course sounds as catch-22, you know, how much of a cultural context has an impact on the formulation of certain dogmas and certain theological ideas, and vice versa, how much certain theologies and certain dogmas have an impact on creating certain cultures. So I think it's extremely complicated.
Maybe just one more thing. I think we inevitably need to work with experiences and we need to work with them critically. And it involves also the work with the experiences of the error, which are vitally important in Christian tradition. And I think there, if we use this contemporary term, we still can learn quite a lot from the tradition. The experiences whose interpretation change over a time, there is no stability in many of the experiences. And as the interpretation changes, new insights come, you may realize that you have experienced something completely different from what you have thought at the beginning. And again, tradition can be, I think, for us a great teacher. I think the skepticism regarding some experiences in tradition is important. If I take, for example, the work Three Forms of Prayer from the school of St. Simeon, the new theologian, the deep skepticism to some of the imaginary prayers that I am in the heaven or that I can be now the spiritual guide of somebody else because I have different movements in my soul. These are so important experiences, but not experiences to be followed, but experiences to learn from where the genuine life ends, basically, because it cannot be developed any further. So this, I think, would be in opposition to the glorification of experiences. And it would, I think, enable us to work with the larger scope of the variation.
Father Andrew. Yeah.
Just as you're talking, Ivana, a point occurred to me, which is, I think it has to be taken into account. Look, are you talking about experience, or are we talking about experiences? Experiences, I think, tend to be individual. There's something that happens to me, and it's what's happening to me that is the experience. Whereas experience on its own is an awareness, a perception of something that is there. I mean, if I see you there, I can be sure that you're there, more or less. But what's important is it's nothing to do with my having a particular feeling when I see you. It's that you're there, and I think experience has this kind of, if you like, a kind of objective element to it, which experiences experiences tend to draw attention to what I feel like when I'm having the experience. And if just that distinction, I think, suggests that there's a lot of thinking to be done about what we are appealing to when we say that by experience I know something. I quite often, I think, when one says by experience I know something, it doesn't mean that I have any particular feeling. It just means that it's something that I've done. And one of the Greek words for experience, the commonest, I think, probably in the Greek spiritual tradition, is pira, which really means testing, rather than having a feeling.
So our experience, I think Father Louth was right in the beginning when he said experience is a very slippery concept, and the way it has been used, I think, so far, is more as a subjective, with an emphasis on the subjective aspect of experience. But experience has become embodied. For instance, if you experience certain things as a priest, which you do, the life of the priesthood involves experiences of certain kinds, right? These become embodied in a way, and they become visible. It's not a coincidence that after 50 or 60 or 70 years of an ascetical life, some monks or nuns look very much like icons of certain saints. There's embodiment there. And to remember also Jacques Maritain, there's connaturality. When something becomes second nature, it becomes part of what one is simply by being lived. So perhaps lived experience with the implication of action, with the implication of embodiment and actualization, will take us away from this sort of fluffy sense of experience where everybody sort of has some kind of awareness and therefore experiences. I don't think that's very helpful, that approach, really. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you very much for that. I really don't like the concept of individual experiences. I think that any experience has a personal and communal dimension, just any experience. And I am not sure about the distinction between the singular and plural, the way I would understand it, whether it would be helpful for me. What I liked is the continuity of experience also, which you emphasize, that it's not often only one single act, but that it belongs to something like a flow of life. But I agree that it's a very slippery concept.
But it's action. Experience involves action and doing. Doing often involves making, transforming. And that becomes part of what one is.
Well, this is what Brentano would say already. This is the sort of the third stage, which is a necessary part of what we call experience.
Apprenticeship, for instance,
yes.
in acting or in any of the crafts, right? You become, that may sound like Zen, but in a sense, it's in all the crafts and in all the arts and in acting, you become that. In music,
yes.
right? You live jointly with the instrument, right? So your body is adapted to it, your whole posture, right? Your relationship to it. This is experience. The other thing is too abstract. when experience is not incarnated in a way, then it is a chimera, right? It's an illusion.
Not always. I think this would be too sharp distinction for me. I think that there can be some experiences which would be more shallow, which can be more fragmented or isolated. I would agree with that. And then when we say that we have experience in something, this would mean, I think, what you say. But I think I would not be happy with discrediting necessarily even what we may call the smaller experiences.
Well, provided that it really means something. I mean, what does it mean for me to have an experience of what? I mean, you can have awareness of something, and often experience is confused with awareness. But experience involves contact and action and transformation in that context.
Yes, well, I would say, for example, that 2 times in my life I have experienced meeting hesychast starec. Only 2 times in my life, so there is no continuity in that. But these experiences would be really important for me. And they would not be only individualist, because they would make access for me to certain tradition. And I would hope that through that I would make that access also available to others. It would have an ecclesial dimension. So, but still this would be, if you want, I'm not an experienced starec, but I have seen 2. And in this sense, I would want to speak about these encounters also in terms of experiences.
Well, that's a matter of choice, I suppose, or taste.
Well, I would like to come back to the question of power, because in the Orthodox experience, it's very much extremes. So either suffer from the state and suffer martyrdom, or become the state, part of the state apparatus, and use, like what happened in the early stage, use the power of the state to suppress heretics. But it's very much the experience of extremes. Either you're suppressed or you're suppressing. The interesting thing is, right now we're living in an age where, let's say in Western Europe, the empire, the European Union, so to speak, is not interested in religion. It's totally disinterested, so basically we're left alone. So that's a totally new experience, and besides that, it's a experience of diversity, because you have all these different Orthodox groups, and they suddenly are together. So it's especially here in Sweden, but also in Holland, we are together, and the outside world says, "Who are you?" And if you respond, "Well, we have metropolitan this and patriarchate that," they forget about it. It's not interesting. They're interested in, who are you? What is your experience? So they really, in my experience, people are really interested in what is so peculiar about Orthodoxy. And we're forced to say, of all these diverse Orthodox groups that ended up together in the diaspora in these countries, in Sweden, Holland, Britain, as long as it's part of the Europe, but it's the same experience, is to answer this question. And then I think one of the fundamental books is Father Andrew's Discerning the Mystery. And for instance, the 2nd chapter, Dissociation of Sensibility, because that's what you see with youth. They try to use the senses to gain experiences, to saturate themselves with new experiences, of the sense perception. But their, let's say, noetic stirrings, they have no idea. They have no idea to place it. So I think instead of wondering about the powers and which patriarchate, we have to answer these questions, because these are real questions that are being asked, and this is a new, unique era. This has never happened before, that we live in freedom, at least here, that we are questioned, and that we're neither oppressed nor the oppressor. So I'm wondering what your thoughts about this.
Just to go back to Cornelia and your discussion here. I remember Sergei Harushi, he defines experience as something that always takes place in the boundaries, the existential boundaries of human being. And that would be kind of, compromise between you, that kind of identification of experience. I'm not sure, okay. But the other thing is about power. Power is something that, for me at least, it's something that is defined, experienced, and developed in relation between the borders and the center, or the periphery of the center. It's how the bishop in diocese relates to the laity out there, not around him. It is the patriarch, how the patriarch relates to the churches out there, not the ones around him. It's also in society. It's how the society treats those in the periphery that defines at least the normative perspective of power. If I would be a little bit critical towards the Orthodox sphere, I would say this is one of the basic problems. That's how power is related between the center and the periphery. It's always strongly associated with identity. And when power is connected with identity, power seems to be absorbed by the center. And that makes a kind of imbalance in the community of believers, or in the community of thinkers, or in a society. And that's what's at stake also in relation to the European Union and the recent election. Periphery and center.
So, to be honest, the discussion about experience perplexes me a bit. In what sense? That what is experience to be juxtaposed to, contradistincted to theory? But even in the title of our conference, Contemplative Traditions, Theory and Practice, theory comes from theoria, I see, which is I experience in a certain sense. So it is contradistincted to what? What is that to which it is against, as it were, so we evaluate it positively or not? To my eyes, the stumbling block, the element of experience that we don't like in this discussion is this very radically subjective interior thing which is supposed to give privileged knowledge, to give a privileged and access to knowledge, etc., which we more or less in this discussion do not like. But this is, A, this is not experience at large, and B, it seems that this is a very particular phenomenon of elements and traditions that are not very easily to be identified with the church, like a modern style mysticism, interiority, esotericism, etc. Let me give just a couple of examples and then leave it. When we say, for example, deification, we do not identify that as an individual experience. I assume that all scholars in the room would feel uneasy at a description of deification as an individual mystical experience of the individual, etc. And it's not only that. Every time there is a testimony concerning divinization, deification in the textual tradition, particularly the modern one, it's never that somebody comes and says, I have seen the uncreated light. In the context of orthodoxy, should a person emerge and say, I have seen the uncreated life, everyone will immediately think that this is a plani, that this is a deception, and that he or she is the victim of that deception. Every time there is such a testimony, it's usually the experience of others. For example, people will see Saint Siluan and say that his face was luminous. The same has been said of Saint Porphyrius, etc. So even that experience, which would in other contexts qualify as mystical subjective experience, is only attested as what others see and never what the individual will profess, etc. Another example would be when Saint Porphyrios, now the contemporary saint, would say, when you are praying for another person, pray, God have mercy on me. Do not say, God have mercy on us all, or on the world, or on that person. Whatever that might mean, it certainly short-circuits the idea of an individualistic experience and a communed experience. Even when it's something about a different person, or everybody, St. Porphyrios said, say about me. Why? Perhaps due to what in theory rather than in experience we would say the shared essence, what Father Nicholas Ludovicos has conceptualized into his theory of consubstantiality, a certain moving consubstantiality, etc. In any case, I think that the punching bag here is not experience per se, but this particular kind of individualistic experience that professes to give privileged access to knowledge, which is a stranger to orthodoxy, except in certain very bizarre quarters like Metropolitan Navpaktos, etc.
Does anyone want to respond to that? You're satisfied, yes. We have a further question, yes, please. And this will be the final one, actually, or comment.
Actually, it was a bit of a pushback to Soteris. I mean, I think you're right in general, but, you know, St. Simeon, the new theologian, is somebody who very clearly talks about his own experience of the uncreated light. It's sometimes said of Simeon that the most amazing thing about him was that he was never condemned as a heretic, but he was absolutely, you know, canonized, glorified, so forth. Macarius, too, would be another person who speaks of his own experience. Palamas, yes, he bases it on the experience of others, but the soon-to-be glorified elder Sophrony Sakharov would be another person who speaks of his own experience. So I don't think it's just in the bizarre quarters, even if it's not exactly mainstream. This, anyway. Well, I don't know if we have this sort of service of glorification or whatever.
It was announced on the 27th of November. No, yes, there are icons of him now. They don't do the Russian thing.
Well, in my ears, which are perhaps fairly Protestant ears, it seems like the discussion about experience and in relation to revelation and power and so on will continue for a little while longer. But this draws the panel discussion to a close. So a warm thank you to all the participants, and give them a hand, please.